Now I want to talk about a new feature that we actually launched in beta about a month ago, but we've been doing continuous improvements to this feature. And now, of course, I also know how to use it well. And this is the Open API import. And what it allows us to do is to take, so I'm just going to create a new project here in our staging environment to illustrate this feature. What you want to do is always is that you want to set up the so I'm just going to use a URL here. It's not so important, but let's use the lab.boozang.com, which is our usual demo site. I recommend checking out the Udemy course on that. Here, as soon as we've done this, of course, I would set up the login, basically the authorization, basically making sure that we can get both the login working, but also that you can get a token for the API if the API requires an authentication token. So this is where it's really good to mix UI and API testing, because oftentimes in the application you'll have the token available in the web browser, and you can then use that to do the API requests. And this is typical when like we do in Boozang, often we mix API and UI tests, okay? So remember, the first thing you want to do is go through here and set up the AI authorization by clicking this button and making sure that you have a test case for logging in, logging out, and retrieving the token. When that's done, now we can go ahead and import the API spec. And what you want to do is you want to be in the root, you want to click this, and then we'll have import Open API specification as an option here. And if you have an API spec that we cannot import, I really urge you to reach out to us at support@boozang.com, because the Open API spec is pretty loose, and we've tried this maybe on 10 or 15 different specifications, but your specification can actually, a lot of developers, the Open API spec is not so strict and it's different. So we love to learn and expand the capability here. It's still a little bit experimental and a little bit cutting edge to make this work. Anyways, I'm going to show you when you have an example where it works pretty well. And this is, I'm working with a company, a marketplace company for micro products like craft products. So in this case, I'm going to import this, and it's going to be here. It's in doc, and we're going to find this. Where is that? Let's see. Okay, there it is. So this is the Open API specification, and of course what you typically would like to do is you would add the authorization module here, and then you would add the token by clicking this checkbox. So that would be the typical way of doing this. But what I'm going to go ahead is just to kind of build the module structure. So what it does is it will create an API module structure based on the Open API spec. So we're going to go ahead here and import, and of course this API is very big, and as you can see, we have a lot of modules here, a lot of different things. In a marketplace, you'll have the different users that are tied to different companies, and in there you'll have a company that's going to own a number of products. You'll have a number of formats, which would be the sub-products, and then of course these are tied to inventory settings and to prices, and then you have orders, etc. So it's a really complex setup. That's where this becomes really powerful. And as you can see, you can move around modules into each other if you believe they should be sub-modules, etc. But right here, I'm just going to click continue, and I'm actually going to choose a prefix here. You'll do that if you want to, But as you can see now, you have API prefix on all the modules. And maybe this is useful in case you mix this with your regular modules, where you might want to keep the API module and the regular UI module separate. So it depends if you kind of want to keep them separate or not. I go ahead and I click continue. And then you can see now it's going to kind of tell you this is all I'm going to do. And as you can see, there's a little warning here. And we see this a lot with Open API spec. It's like they give the ID, the API can actually take the ID, which is usually something that's being generated by the API. So I usually remove the ID, and I do that for all the endpoints. It just means that, for instance, I never would use the ID when I would retrieve something in the post, like when I want to create something, right? And I wouldn't send the ID in the post. I would create it and expect to get the ID back. So that's all that means. And now comes to the work you got to do. And this is a little bit of work. And you would go in here and you would do the foreign key mapping. And I'm going to try and explain this. This is like an alias, right? So very often you have a number of aliases where, in this case, I'm going to illustrate something. For instance, a brewer ID here, that's a company, right? So for instance, if you say create company, you want to tie it together. If it replies with the company ID, if you're mapping something later, you kind of want to tell them a brewer ID is a company ID. And the way you would do that is you would basically select company ID, and then we use this thing that is usually takes an existing company ID, and this can automatically actually extract the company ID from the temporary database, which is something super powerful. So now also a buyer ID would also be a company ID, and as you see, it remembers here. So what you want to do is probably you want to test drive this one time and then play around with it and see what it did, and then you probably want to do this properly, So that's what you do. You'll go through here and you'll do all these mappings, and maybe you would need some developer help in case it wasn't you who've been working and developing this API, and you'll go ahead and start this process. And as you can see, all the modules are being generated. And what we're trying to do here is, of course, we're trying to create the module for each data type. Then we want to create kind of CRUD operations as specified in the Open API spec: create, edit, delete, right? And also find, right? Which is usually the GET request. And then what we want to do is we also want to try and capture the different dependencies and do the mapping as best as we can. And here you can actually see what are the mappings that we've done. And if I would have done my work better, of course, we would see much more things that would be matched. A little note that we're just going to let this finish. That relationship that we saw can be found here in the import. We'll have that review module initial parameter mapping. So you can go back and find that here, if you see what I mean. So you can always go back and of course also map here if you need to. So let's go into one of them. For instance, companies. You would go in and here, let's see, it's a little bit of a bug it looks like. Let's do this. Let's do a refresh just in case. So this is pretty novel functionality. So maybe when I didn't do all the mappings, we had some issue. But here you can see, I think it just needed a refresh. As you can see, we now see the kind of API module here, which is also kind of part of our AI functionality. When you do model-based development, your UI would also be mapped using this kind of thing. But of course, you can also switch between tests and the old classical view where you have the API tests and you have the the regular tests. We also try to generate a scenario, which is the create scenario, where we have, as you can see, a number of steps. But of course, this is a lot of guesswork on our side. So we're going to go back to this view. And what you can see here, what's very important to note is if you hit the settings, you'll have all the fields available here. And there you can see exactly what did we do. And as you can see, we made some guesses on the data format. But here you can, of course, modify this. And this, as you can see, is a regular expression. So it will generate some. And you can also set dependencies, which can be very, very useful. In this case, let's look at find products and how you want to look at this. As you can see, it's created with bset skip per default, which means it will actually skip this parameter. So if you want to, for instance, find a product or something, you would just want to make sure that when you go in here, as you can see, you can select now, okay, use this regular expression to generate this field. But you can also find if you have in the temporary database already a company ID available, it will show up here in the drop-down. So this gives you a little bit of a feeling. Of course, this is highly complex functionality. We are trying to kind of do as much work and as much of the heavy lifting as possible for you to get started with your API tests from the Open API specification. A bit experimental, but what I really want you to take away is if you have any problems here, don't hesitate to reach out, because we love, if your Open API specification isn't a secret, we love and see how different companies are solving this kind of Open API, how they, design their API, and then we can also make our tool much better at doing as much of the work for you as possible. So there'll be more videos on this particular functionality, but here is an introduction of how you want to think when you get started with Open API.